I think that you can commission or invite people to contribute to a program. You can also encourage them to interact somehow within the program as it's running in the space. But participation for me requires some kind of further investment on the behalf of the person you're working with or collaborating with, whereby normally it has a relationship to a durational aspect to the project. So you form some kind of collaboration, and the person you're working with is so invested and so intrigued by the project, and perhaps also the institution, in this case SALT, and our approach to programming, that they then, in collaboration again, produce something beyond and above the expectation for the actual exhibition you're working on. For example, I could mention Celine Condorelli's work with us. We invited her to produce the support structure for an exhibition called Scramble for the Past, whereby her podiums and other structural entities would host archaeological objects. But through discussions in developing the design, she was the one that actually suggested that perhaps they could have a lifespan beyond that exhibition. And so together this project then became a new installation that happened in the forum space in Salt Bayolu called Surrounded by the Uninhabitable. And for me that really was her willingness and her investment in the project allowed her to then participate within the institution and within our programming team. A former example perhaps that led to that was a project we did with John Altay. It was an exhibition called Normalization. And initially the exhibition was kind of a straightforward thematic show about normalization that took place in Platform Garanti with about 8 artists invited to contribute works. But what happened next was that a conversation with John Altay resulted in this idea of normalizing the first project and then normalizing in a third project the first two. So we worked together on his installation, but that required him and us to go back to everybody that had originally contributed and ask them to be much more invested again in the program. So their participation was that they then reconsidered their own work in his narrative. Some of them actually reformulated, or for example, one painter actually painted a detail of her first exhibited painting for the second stage of the project. So for me, yeah, participation is very linked to this kind of durational and ongoing relationship you can have with somebody else that you're willing to contribute with.
regards to the practice of exhibition making and the idea of making exhibitions, I think two notions or two elements that intrigue me most are, one is the temporal dimension, meaning that it's always durational, it's always time-based, and the other is the idea or the question, what happens to the works or components that make up an exhibition after that show is over. And in both these senses, SALT has been an interesting site of experimentation, not only on behalf of my work, but on basically in relation to the exhibitions they have been organizing. For example, the idea of the durational was, in my opinion, explored in the Becoming Istanbul exhibition, where almost on a daily basis there were changes in the space and there were meetings and discussions, and that duration was maybe even felt to the extent that physically you were there almost every day, you were present, you wanted to go because someone interesting was speaking within the exhibition, within the confines of the exhibition, or other projects that involved also my contribution in earlier senses, but also recent exhibitions that take certain elements and recompose them in a different context. Well, in a kind of related way, my work for Hüseyin Bahri Alptekin show was taking kind of large-scale sculptural installation that was originally made for the public space, outer space, bringing it back, cutting it apart and making a new work here.
various different kinds of collaboration that happen within SALT's programs and research team. In the case of the recent exhibition, Gülsüm Kara Mustafa, a promised exhibition that I worked on with Merve, it was quite clear that it was going to be a very equal collaboration, where we pitched the project together, we selected the artists, we shared it with the program's team, and everybody decided it was a good idea to include it in the program, after which we contacted the artist, took over the archival research together, and then planned the exhibition,
and the concept,
selected the works. The concept came out during the process. We could also say that the artist also became a collaborator in that way.
because we were not really familiar with the production phases of the works.
That's true. So she was able to guide us through and also played a part in selecting and putting the works in place. So that was quite an equal collaboration. But you have another example.
Last year we had a year-long project with Van Abbe Museum. It was called South Van Abbe Istanbul Eindhoven. And we had 3 exhibitions for this. The last exhibition, Modern Times, we collaborated with Van Abbe Museum. We got several works from the collection. We combined it with local names, which we usually get from collectors in Turkey. But we also had a leading art historian, Zeynep Yasayaman. She was helping there. She was basically helping us to pick up the names and the works. So with Van Abbe, South Van Abbe exhibitions, we had with the last one, we had a very rich collaboration, different from the first 2 Van Abbe exhibitions as well.
And also in each Van Abbe, we had two people from SALT working on it. One more as a leading role, the other one more as a supporting role, doing the project coordination. And then in your case, in the 3rd exhibition, we also had
outside help from Zeynep Yasayaman.
So it varies according to the needs of the project.
Thinking about SALT's activity for the last 2-3 years, the first thing that comes to my mind is the revisiting of certain mythical or forgotten periods of Turkish art and culture. These periods were mostly not discussed because of the lack of institutions during that era. And I think SALT puts them back in, kind of provides a new context of discussing them, as the discussion regarding 90s in the connection, connecting it with the relationship between artists, or discussing 70s in a political context. The other thing is the SALT, I think, takes sometimes risky decisions and expects a lot from the visitor. So these, discussing this Atatürk Cultural Center in a connection with building, construction, history of construction techniques, that creates a new branch to discuss kind of calcified problems. So you leave SALT with good questions in your head, and you might not always be able to get into the show, but then again, this provides it creates a possibility for fresh perspectives.
I was invited to do an exhibition at SALT based on a research project of mine. Through the process of the exhibition, which actually was a very intuitive process, because I was approached to do an exhibition based on a building in the modern history of Turkey, and through the discussions and the process of conversations with the people at SALT, it became a completely different project in the end. None of us actually had imagined that it would become, that it would be formalized in the way it has been formalized right now in the exhibition, also maybe conceptualized. This process actually, working with SALT for the exhibition, gave me an insight about the people at SALT and the institution that I had no connection to beforehand became an assembly of people that I knew how to have a conversation with, and I knew how they thought, and we had, it becomes an intimate relationship. And therefore, the institution is no longer an institution in an abstract sense for you, but it's the people you know, which is wonderful if you're working in the creative environment with them, and when you're inside the circle, then one also wants to think about it. If I was not invited, for instance, if you're outside of the circle, how do you access this institution? Because, for instance, the modern essay series I have experience, so I can speak of that, is a great series that dwells with modern history of Turkey, but it's in a way set up in a pretty intuitional way. It's not, it doesn't formulate things in an encyclopedic way. So therefore, if you do not have any categorization, if it's an intuitional series of work, if you are outside of the circle, and if you have no first-hand knowledge first-hand intimate knowledge or personal knowledge with this institution, how do you access that from the outside? Because most of these researchers are done with a hand that reaches from the inside to the outside. But I think one needs to think, not that it doesn't exist, but one needs to think how a hand from the outside to the inside can actually approach and be part of these exhibitions.
I started working at SALT with this exhibition indeed, and it was an exhibition about the certificates of authenticity in art. And within this project, we displayed the documents that serve as the deed itself for the artwork, or the fiscal invoice, or the legal statement. The exhibition itself was pre-curated, and it was a traveling exhibition. So I was like the mediator between the curators and SALT institution. For this exhibition, we created a separate space inside the exhibition hall, exhibition space, and we had a huge table with the books related to the issue of the show. And within this period, we invited artists and lawyers for the workshops, and we asked them to tell about their own stories and what they have done, or what they their own cases that they had. And we asked lawyers how we can improve, or how the artists can manage to have these certificates for each of their works in order to sell, or have their own work in the art market. Actually, in the beginning, I was not say interested, but I wasn't really aware of the value of this exhibition, and I wasn't thinking that it would be that interesting. In order to talk about the Turkey case, we have a huge gap in the certificates of authenticity and the authorship, originality of work. And artists have some problems to prove the authorship of the artworks that they had. And I think because of that, this exhibition filled a huge gap
the question is, what makes working with SALT different than working with any of the host of cultural institutions and organizations that Projects has collaborated with over the past 10 years? Well, I mean, I think that in a word, the difference is that working with SALT is open. That's to say that, there's an incredible and sometimes terrifying amount of freedom in working with the institution because unlike other institutions where structures have these kind of typical paths and people have job descriptions that are mostly accurate, and when somebody is hired to design a book, they then design a book. With SALT, it sometimes happens that you're hired to design an identity or a logo, and in fact, you end up making a curatorial exhibition program, or that you are designing an exhibition, and in fact, you end up programming events. So there's a kind of weird crossover and flexibility and mutability, which again is sometimes. There's sometimes something scary about that because it means that in every situation, rather than being able to ever say, oh, well, I just did the thing you told me to, you actually always have to say, well, I'm doing the thing that I think is right for this scenario. I'm going to propose to SALT exactly what needs to happen here. And I think with that kind of freedom comes a lot of responsibility, which is why working with SALT always feels a little bit more like working with a peer or a partner rather than feeling like working for somebody. And I guess that's why it's still interesting and fun and productive for us and hopefully for them as well.